Welcome, Austin, Jim, and Al. We're continuing our series here on the history of wargaming and Jim efforts there. And what we'd like to talk about today, Jim, is Panzer Blitz. But before we get to Panzer Blitz was preceded by a game called Tactical Game 3, which was one of your test series games. Do you want to explain that a little bit before we dive into Panzer Blitz?
Yeah, this is an idea that myself, Al, Nofi, and Steve Patrick, our lawyer from New Jersey, came up with. I think John Young had some input into that as well. And the idea was doing a series of games covering all periods of history, not using the same system, but tactical level games. Al was an expert on the Renaissance and some of those early periods. Steve and Al were both interested in the Roman, the Greek period, and I figured, well, I can handle the modern period. And one of those early games we published in the magazine, I forget what issue it was Tactical Game 3. And that was my first pass at Panzer Blitz. It impressed people, but it impressed Tom Shaw more than anything else. Now, at this point, I got to reel back a little bit, a few years, to my relationship with Tom, who's a great guy, always has been. We always got along well. He was about 10 years older than me, but in those days, that seemed like an eternity. He was the old man. Anyway, in 1965, Avalon Hill published Battle of the Bulge, which was a cool game. But I was doing research on World War II down in Washington at the World War II Records Branch, and I just pulled up the data that had not yet been published by the Army. The Army was doing its own series of histories, which I forget when the Bulge came out, but it was much later.
Those were the green books, right,
yes,
Jim?
Indeed. Yes. And they were excellent works. And I noticed that the order of battle for Bulge was out of whack. And so I wrote a letter to Tom back in the days when you actually wrote a letter and on a typewriter and everything. And I pointed out this, and I said, have you guys ever considered, sending somebody down to the World War II Records Branch? Well, it turned out their two designers at the time were two local high school students. What the hell was the names?
Plinsky?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, Pinsky and what's his name? The other guy.
Yeah, I can't.
But anyway, they were both very bright guys. They went on to college and graduate school and et cetera. And I ran into Larry Pinsky later when he came up to visit at SPI. He flew up his own airplane from Texas. And we discussed what was going on back then. That's how I got a lot of my insight into how it worked, before I walked in the door. Well, Tom asked me to stop by in Baltimore, and I did. And he said, the anniversary of World War II is coming, World War I is coming up, and 50th anniversary. And he says, maybe we should do a game on that. I demurred. I said, World War I was kind of a downer, but, they've been very successful with their World War II games. They'd already done Africa Corps and U-Boat and D-Day. And he said, well, how about Jutland? I said, okay, I'll do Jutland, tactical game. That did very well. I mean, it was unique for Avalon Hill because they'd never done a game using, in effect, cardboard miniatures. And that did very well. So he asked me to do one on the ground battle, 1914. Well, I said, oh, man, I said, there's no motion in that one. He says, the opening stages. Well, I says, yeah, you got some motion, but it stops real quick. I says, okay, I did it. It was a complicated game. I don't like complicated games. And doing my own production, he expected me to provide all the art. And this meant a game board, and what a headache that was. Anyway, it didn't sell as well as Jutland, and he decided to try another outside designer. Now, I should point out now, when they lost Larry Pinsky and what's his name? God, his name escapes me. That was the end of their designers. They never had full-time designers on the staff, and apparently he couldn't round up anybody of Pinsky and the other guys, caliber. I think the last games they did were Guadalcanal. That was the one. Yeah, that came after Bulge in '66. Maybe they'd already done it before they had to, go off to college, and. So I said, well, there's other guys out there. Now, I don't know if I introduced him to Dave Williams. I remember, meeting Dave Williams at that time. He came down to visit us at SPI, which at that point I think was in a third floor loft on 23rd Street. And I encouraged, him because Dave, had a knack for it. As I kept telling people that, if you can play the games, with a little extra effort, you can design them. Because any game is really just an amalgam of previous game design and mechanics. You might have to invent a few new ones. And Dave I had already done an Italy game for the test series games. And I don't know, I guess he had that. And they wanted him to do a game on Anzio. And he did it. It was a very good game. Came out in 1969. Now, at that point, I'd started SPI. And this sort of, this sent a message to Tom. He said, oh, my God. We were grinding them out, as it were, and we were doing quite well. And he said, well, how about doing a game for us? Now, instead of, if you wanted a new game, I said, what about a spiffed up version of Tactical Game 3, Panzer Blitz? Now, I sweated blood on that one. I mean, rarely did I have as much trouble getting a game to work as I did with Panzer Blitz. And even as published, there was one glaring exception in the rules, which was problematic, called Panzer Bush. In other words, you could hide. There was a trick. I tried to eliminate all those. We caught a lot of others, but that one got past us until it was fixed in a later rules revision. But it sold like hot. I think it ultimately sold over 300,000 copies. And I made, I split the royalties with Redmond. I got 60%, he got 40%. And his graphics were, outstanding. And that really impressed him. In addition to getting a slightly higher royalty, and they paid a very small royalty, not like books where you got 10, 15%. It was 1/10 of that. I also got a designer and developer, an artist credit, which was the first. But he was that desperate to get a game. And Eric Dott, who was his boss, the corporate, head honcho, he went along with that. But I think he also told Tom, I says, Tom, maybe we got to hire or I guess Tom came up with this, look, we really need some in-house designers. Because for the next 2 years, I had a deal with Tom. I says, look, I can't design any unique games just for Avalon Hill, but I'll tell you what, games we publish in the magazine, you had dibs on. You can basically buy those. And he bought, the France 1940. Oh, I did do one other game. I think it was just for Avalon Hill, Origin to World War II. I forget if there was an SPI version of that.
I think it was.
Which?
I also did Origin to World
Tactical game.
No, the Origins of World War II.
World War II.
Oh, Origin. I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah, Avalon Hill had a version of that.
No, did we publish a version of that?
No, I don't. We
Okay, we just did it for that. And I did one more game for them. Now, he got France 40, and that was working for him. And then he said, look, I says, can you do a game? What can't you do a game on? I said, I can do a game on anything. So he made a bet. Now, this was one of those serendipitous things. He said, all right, how about getting lost in the woods? I said, no problem. When do you want it? And that became Outdoor Survival. Now, the kicker in Outdoor Survival was he would pay me a higher royalty if it outsold a game he had done. I think he had done it, called Kriegspiel, which is an abstract, tactical game. That came out the same year as Panzer Blitz, and it didn't sell nearly as well, but he figured it would sell better than a game on getting lost in the woods or surviving being lost in the woods. It didn't. From right at the gate, Outdoor Survival did much better. Now, that Outdoor Survival kept selling more and more and more into the 70s. Eventually, I found out why. When Dungeons and Dragons came along, Outdoor Survival was the ideal game for a strategic level D&D to set up their scenarios.
Yeah.
And that people would buy that and they would modify it. This is some part of the Lord of the Rings universe where they could break whatever laws they wanted because they owned the game and they weren't publishing it, but they used it to generate their tactical scenarios. So it basically got its wind and never really lost it. But after that, they decided I think I got a call from Tom, I guess in late 71. And he says, we're thinking of hiring somebody to edit the General, that's their magazine, and help out with the full-time guy and help out with the design. So I recommended Don Greenwood, whom I knew as a very avid wargamer who was publishing one of the many zines. I forget which one he was publishing. But these would sell, a few 100,000 or so copies, which is a big deal. You can make money on that. Not a lot. And I remember he stopped by he stopped by in 71 or 70, he stopped by in New York because I remember I saw him in the that old 3-story loft, which we were only for about a year before we moved over to down the block to 23rd and Park Avenue South. We were there for 8 years. We were on the 3rd floor, then we moved up to the 7th floor or something like that. And he took the job and he did very well. Tom was pleased with that. And then I think it was Don who brought in Randy Reed. I didn't know Randy. I knew of him, but I didn't know him like I knew Don. And Randy turned out to be very good. And so that was their two-man in-house design team. Now, eventually they did solicit outside games, and they started like Jedco, an Australian company, which was doing some great stuff. They basically bought a number of their games. John Prados, they collected, a outside designers, and they sold bigger numbers than SPI, so that was an attraction. Although we got a lot of them anyway, the outside designers. And that basically, they didn't need SPI anymore. They were designing enough for their own. In fact, I think by 74, that was the year they published 8 games. They designed and got out 8 games. That was just, Randy and Don, plus whatever, freelancers they picked up in Baltimore. And that was basically the end of it. He got my games. Apparently, he later told me that Eric Dott was kind of a little scared of us, because we could turn out these games so quickly. And the outdoor survival really spoke to him. And because you just told him you could do a game on anyone and you should get lost in the woods and it became a bestseller. I says, Jesus, they never offered me a job. But anyway, well, how could you possibly? I was running their main competitor. By 74, 75, we were the biggest producer of board games. And dollar-wise, I think we were getting close to Avalon Hill, which is still selling exclusively through the retail channel. Box, games. And they were still publishing a lot of non-war games, but the war games had become their bread and butter. So that's basically what happened with Avalon Hill. In the meantime, I was also encouraging other designers out there to start your own. We wrote a book. When did that come out? War Game Design? That was 76.
Yeah, it was in that period.
Yeah, but even
in fact, just as an aside, the first time I was exposed to you was through that book, because I was an avid reader, and I said there has to be a book on design out there. And I had a librarian that I lived in a really small community, but she knew how to use the interloan system, and she got that in hardcover for me to read. And so there's a little tiny school library up in Idaho that has that book in hardcover.
Well, the origins of that book came from when we were publishing all this stuff in the S&T. Like we had this column, Outgoing Mail, which I wrote, every 2 months. And I designed, I basically discussed in some issues, the game business. We published our numbers. I discussed the mechanics of, getting the artwork and what have you. And this basically inspired guys like the Game Designers Workshop out in, where were they, Illinois, and several other, companies, a couple in New York City and some in California. I mean, they were popping up all over the place. And they were making, well, at least they were breaking even, because we would let them advertise in S&T. You couldn't advertise in the General. The General never took ads from the competition. And the only reason we got started was because there was one rival wargaming magazine, Strategy and Tactics, published out of Japan and later in New Jersey, which was not making money. And we basically bought that for $1 and then added a game to it, spiffed up the art. Redmond spiffed up the design of it. In fact, he had contributed to it. I think he might have been the one that put me onto it. And I think the first edition of S&T came out in the end of '69, and that basically revolutionized not just the paper game business, but it basically set the model for games in general to this very day. Because when the computers came along, and at the end of the '70s, I was giving in one of my lectures, I go to the Origins, the convention, and I give God knows a dozen or more talks. It was just Dunnigan, rambling on. And one of them was Napoleon and IBM. Now, we already had, we had a mini computer in the early 70s. We got microcomputers about 6-7 years later, and we were using them for business. And, we wrote programs for help with game design and what have you. And I realized, and I followed the industry. I got the computer industry magazines. There were, the tech ones, not just the consumer ones. And they were already talking about the coming advances in not just processing power, which was not a big deal for a strategic, putting a manual game on a computer, but for graphics. In other words, once you could put the game board on the screen, and you could do that by the early 80s, in glorious color and fairly high resolution, 800 by 600, whatever. But anyway, compared to today, that's crude. But back then, it was amazing. I said, this is going to be the future. In fact, when I left in '80, we were doing our first war game. We were computerizing a game I did, the Loss of the Pandora, a space, science fiction game. That actually got done for Apple, because again, Apple was the only computer that had decent graphics compared to the IBM, for the Radio Shack and what have you. The IBM had just come out in '81, I think '82, the personal computer. But none of them really had much in the way of graphics, because Apple came out in '84 with the Macintosh, and that had the graphics of the future. A tiny screen, but still. I don't think the Pandora, I left in '80 and SPI went belly up in '83, I guess it was.
Yeah, I had the, I guess it would have been it was a prototype copy.
Beta.
Yeah.
It
wasn't even beta. It was like, you could move the characters back and forth, but there was no combat or anything yet going on. It was.
I forget. The version I had, I thought, was fairly complete. I lent it to somebody who never got it back, which just goes to show you. But anyway, I had to borrow an Apple to play it. I eventually started getting Apples for business reasons. That's another story. I went through several of those. But Apple always impressed me because they were one step ahead and several steps ahead in price, but one step ahead in technology. And for a while, that's where all the gamers were going. But then they realized that it was the PCs, the IBM standard PC, that was generating the huge numbers, and started to see more and more games. Now, that didn't destroy the paper games business, but it basically overtook it. And throughout the '80s and into the early '90s, I'd be bumping into guys working, for the various computer game companies who had been fans of SPI in the early days. That generation has since passed on. Now there's generation SPI. What's that? But anyway, the pioneers in the computer. Yeah, right. The boys out in Utah were designing war games as well, and they recognized, some of them had heard the Napoleon at IBM, lecture, which basically described a war game using high resolution graphics, which weren't going to be available for another, until the early '80s, late '80s, really, but that's all she wrote after that. Now, you still have people publishing manual games. In fact, S&T is still being published out in California. And the key guy there is Joe Miranda, who I think has just surpassed my record for number of games designed and published.
Yeah, I think he's pretty darn close, or he's gone past it.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure he's best, but he's still grinding them out.
Yeah, because he's been doing it for 2 decades, and you only did it for 1.
Yeah, and he did most of the games for S&T after I guess after the '90s, well, late '80s, early '90s.
Right.
And he wouldn't do them all, but he'd do most of them. So he was knocking out 20 or 30 a year.
Yeah.
So it wasn't long before he'd catch up. Anyway, so there's still a market for him, although I think the circulation of S&T now, I think it publishes a with game or without game version, what have you. But it was, last time I checked about 10 years ago, it was only about 5,000.
Yeah, they actually went to an interesting model where they've actually got 3 magazines now. They've got the old S&T, and they do something called Modern War, where they only focus on modern stuff, and then they do a World War II one.
Yeah.
And
they still publish games, so I think they're semi-detached. You can order both the magazine and a game, but mostly it's one or the, what you can order one or the other.
Yeah, their strategy is they'll put I think it's to attract new blood they put the magazine only one in Barnes and Nobles and other places that have magazine racks, and so and so then you pick it up, and then there's a way to order the game if you would like to try out the game.
Yeah.
So
yeah. S&T always basically had that approach. We had 2 main articles in there. One was basically on the subject of the game in the magazine. So they probably saw the wisdom of saying, well, we don't have to put the game in there. We'll just do the article.
Right. Yeah, I think that's what they saw.
And explain what can happen if you turn this into a game. Yeah, they're smart guys out there.
Yeah.
It's run by a retired Army doctor.
Chris Cummings.
Yes.
Yeah. And he's getting on in years. But anyway, he was a war gamer like a lot of guys in the Army were. and they picked up on this. Now, it's still a lot cheaper. If you want to get into the war games publishing business, it's a lot cheaper to do it with manual games, paper games, than it is with the computer games. Although some people there are tools available now. I'm not talking about the engines, the game engines you can buy, and there's really only one game engine, which I think changed their rules. So if you sell less than $1 million worth of your game, you don't have to pay royalties. Let's see, what's the name of the engine?
Well, there's a couple of 3D engines out there, and then there's the one that you can do both 2D and 3D in, which is Unity, I think is the name of it.
Yeah, I forget the name, but they were the big deals. I remember in the 90s when I was doing a job for the Air Force, they wanted a game. I forget what it was, an intelligence game or something like that. But anyway,
Yeah, but Jim, you and I worked on that at the Air Intelligence School down in
San Antonio.
and
Yeah.
it was a sensor warfare game.
Right. That was it.
Yeah,
And
and
that actually turned out to be very popular with people in the Air Force.
actually it did.
But it basically was abandoned because a new colonel would come in charge of the training aids, whatever compartment. He said, well, I don't like this. And that was always a problem. And I remember once they invited me down to the War College, they had published a game, but they had created a game, the McClinic Theater model, which is based on one of the NATO Warsaw Pact games we did. And the guy who basically programmed it was Fred McClinic. So they called it McClinic Theater model. It was a very good game. But as I pointed out, they had a global users, meeting, as it were, a conference.
Mm-hmm.
And they had me to talk. And I says, look, these games, the good ones, are living things. You've got to keep updating them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not just talking about the design, but the software, because new computers come along, more powerful computers, and you have to take advantage of it. Now, the problem that ran into was the Army is a bureaucracy, and it's such a hassle, to get money for, converting something to a new something. They've always had a problem with that. The government, non-Department of Defense, is even worse. They're still running stuff that was COBOL programs when the IBM 360 was the main iron, you designed for. But that's another problem. With with Python and the other languages available today, and the developer kits.
Yeah,
there's a lot more of that. Anybody who's got some chops as a programmer and as a war gamer, they can design their own and publish it on the web. And of course, Steam. I don't know if Steam.
Yeah, Steam is doing some good things where they're letting indies come in and do some stuff, but it still doesn't have the computer games don't have the organization, the ecosystem that the published games on paper do. You've got Board Game Geek that is out there. You've got a bunch of people doing different online sites. You've got Consim World, that is an area for the grognards together. You've still got grognards.com. And so you've got a lot more action going on and more intellectual discussion of the games than you get with the computer games. And that's what you always talked about, is because somebody can come in there and tear the rules apart and look at it, and the computer games are obtuse, and not obtuse but opaque in the ability to get to the rules and understand exactly what the rules are doing and how they work.
Tina is the problem on that. The God's in the machine, and you can't see them.
Yeah.
Actually, a lot of game developers recognize that problem. It wasn't just war games, but computer games in general, and a lot of the more strategic games. I guess Civilization, which is still kicking after 20 or 25
Yeah,
years.
they're on version 6 now.
Jesus. But anyway, they from the beginning had a lot of customization, user customization tools. You could make your own maps. You could modify a lot of the rules, and I think there's even an option in some of the versions, probably the later ones, where you can even turn on it telling you what the odds are and blah blah blah. In other words, goes through all the things you normally have to face in person on a manual game.
Well, and you know what? That's because I met Sid once, the designer of. And he's an old war gamer. And
yes, in fact, that one published Advanced Civilization, the war game version.
Yeah. So I want to rewind, though, Jim, back to Panzer Blitz, because there were a number of things that you did there that were unique and basically first. first of all, before you guys started doing the test series games, there hadn't been anything done that tactical, right?
Right. That was what made it so difficult. And that's one reason why, the gang of 3 or 4, including me and Al, came up with the idea for the tactical series games. In fact, we published the whole melange of them, the 6 or 7 or 8 of them, whatever it was.
But by the way, just out of interest, those tactical games on eBay go for in the $700 to $800 range.
God, I knew I should have,
kept some.
And I had one at one time. I think it was test 3, and I was playing it as a freshman at Rice. Is when with one of my
they
buddies, and I don't have it anymore. I haven't seen it probably yet.
Other ones, your other S&Ts will get up in the $100 range, like Chicago goes for about $150, which we'll have to talk about at another time. But I want to get back to Panzer Blitz. So the other thing was the modular map.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that was new, right?
That was necessary because the idea behind that game was there are many different scenarios in the Eastern Front, and to give the game variety, that was always a problem with games. If you had the same map, that was a fixed element, and it was easier for gamers to basically break the game, figure out a way to not cheat, but basically come up with a tactic which took advantage of the game mechanics to make it too easy for one side or the other to win. So we were always aware of that. And since Avalon Hill was paying for all this production, I said, well, why not just boards? Individual boards just stick together, because they had mounted boards and everything. And
he called it geomorphic.
Right.
Yeah, and that name has stuck.
They all fit together no matter how you arrange them.
Yeah.
And of course, here's something that most people aren't aware of unless they speak Russian. All the names on the board were in English alphabet, but they were in Russian. And what I did was, as one, nobody realized this is being done with a sense of humor, as it were, as much as one can, humorize the Soviet Union. The State Farm on one of the boards was called State Farm 69, so that was a little like 60s humor. But all the names, one name I remember, I forget all the names, but the one that always stuck with me was Bednost, which means hunger, and that was the name of one of the villages. But they were all named like that, and since very few people spoke Russian, or that they said this must be some sort of accident. But it was true to the period, because I later found out when the Soviet Union fell apart, their archives were opened up, and they actually published the casualty data from World War II, actually for the 20th century up to World War II. But the main thing everybody was looking at was World War II. 29 million people died. Most of them were from non-combat causes, and most of those were civilians. So basically, most of the dead were civilians, because every time the Germans rolled through a village, burned it, looted it and what have you, drove the civilians away, and winter came, a lot of those people would die from starvation, explosion, and what have you. And that's something even the Russians tried to cover up, because basically during the war they lost 18% of the population, men, women, and children. But it was mainly, a lot of them were women and children. But even in areas Russia controlled, there was never enough food. Not just Leningrad, but everywhere. But basically, their tactic, which was militarily sound, was to concentrate all resources, to the point of main effort, and that meant secondary fronts were on short rations until they could capture enough food, when in areas they chased the Germans out of, to get farming going again, what have you. In fact, it was the American, God knows how many millions of Russians the American lent lease, because we sent them a lot of food. Spam was very popular, and we sent them wheat and what have you. That was mainly through the northern ports, at the Pacific ports, where the Japanese and Russians had a truce. So the Russian ships would come into America, load up on all sorts of supplies, take them into Vladivostok, put them on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which was worked real hard, and basically kept a lot of Russians alive, because they simply didn't have the food to keep everybody fed. But anyway, we were aware of factors like that. I mean, our games were notable for taking into account logistics. Now, some of the Avalon Hill games did as well, but not as much as us. I mean, we didn't go crazy with that. I said, look, you got to have logistics, but it's got to be playable.
Yeah, I think it's Don Greenwood has a phrase that says nobody wants to play quartermaster general.
Exactly. But without it, you're very realistic. And I think the North Africa games were famous for that, even the Avalon Hill ones, because really what was critical was control of the Mediterranean. The RAF held on to Malta, because it basically prevented the Italians and the Germans from having a free ride, from Sicily, from the Buda, from Italy straight across to Tunisia, which the Italians had turned into a colony. So it was really the tactical. And when the United States entered the war in late 41, by 42, we were sending enough planes and tanks and what have you, especially aircraft. It basically enabled the British to basically hold on in Malta, which was basically under constant attack for several years before Montgomery and Patton finally took Sicily and forced the Italians out of the war. But yes, and there were many games where logistics was absolutely important.
So let's talk a little bit about, I don't know if there were, I was trying to get a copy of this so I could look at it before we talked, but Panzer Group Guderian had some interesting features to it. And this was the one that Avalon Hill picked up, was that they
83, 84, they bought it.
Right.
Now, the thing with the Panzer Group Guderian was the example of what the Germans were up against in their rush to take Moscow. Now, Smolensk was in what is now Belarusia, and it was a key staging area for the final jump, to Moscow, which the Germans only got sight of, at the towers of Moscow, and then they had to retreat. But the problem was you had to keep your lines of communication, or the roads. The Germans were rebuilding the railroads as quickly as they could, but basically, the last 100 or so kilometers, had to be handled by truck or even horse-drawn. Another thing most people don't realize in World War II, that the German army basically moved by horse.
Yeah.
I think, who was it? One of our chums, the Hippo Train.
Rich DiNardo.
Rich DiNardo, right.
He
right.
did that.
The place.
The
When he was at the, where was he? At the Navy?
he was in graduate school when he did.
Oh,
Yeah, that was his doctoral dissertation.
I helped Jim. I helped him do some of the translation from the stuff, from the material he found. I think it was in a library in Freiburg, Germany. Back on, it was fascinating. It was German remount problems in World War II.
Yeah, it was amazing how much horse flesh they had to use.
Absolutely.
The one advantage to that was when your transportation died, you could eat it. But truck, as long as you had the trucks and the wheels. And the Americans were amazed when they got into Europe in 1944, as they were overrunning, German divisions, that a lot of these divisions had captured trucks and vehicles of over a dozen different models from different countries.
Yeah.
And it must have been a logistics, maintenance nightmare.
Yeah.
And indeed it was, and that's one reason why they were very fragile, even though many of their units were motorized and a lot of their strategic transportation. And that's why in fact, any Battle of the Bulge game has to rely on logistics, because that's what really limited the German advance. They expected to overrun Allied supply dumps, which there's the famous story of the petroleum dump the Americans were guarding. And they never did capture that. And in fact, it was on a hill, and the Americans rolled down the barrels of gasoline and what have you, petrol, and lit it afire. And the Germans said, well, screw this, we'll have to just limp along. These bastards are not going to give it up. But the Germans were in very bad shape. And in fact, the Battle of the Bulge was only possible because they basically issued all the orders by letter, that had to be hand delivered, as where they didn't use radio. They hadn't figured out the ultra system yet, the code breaking. But they said, we got to guarantee security. And they did. And it was a surprise. But it was a short-lived surprise, because those Germans, they had 1 or 2 loads of fuel for their tanks. And after that was gone, so was the offensive. And Patton to turn around and hit him in the flank as soon as he did. But anyway, even on the Eastern Front, it was the same thing. The Russians were getting all this petroleum, from their own oil fields on the Caspian, what is now Azerbaijan, and of course some kinds of fuel they had to get from the United States. For example, aviation fuel. Their refineries just couldn't make the high quality stuff that made their aircraft perform best. And after the war, I guess it was after the Soviet Union fell, we could ask some of the old timers, what were the most important things logistically you got from the United States? And they said, well, it was high octane fuel, waterproof communications wires. They couldn't make that, as well as they needed. And I think tactical radios, because throughout the war, most of their tanks didn't have radio. the company commander had a radio, and otherwise it was hand signals. And so the Russians got around that. And by the end of the war, I think all their their tanks, or at least the 1 in 4, every platoon, had the leader had a radio, and it was much easier to communicate. So there were a lot of shortcomings that you had to take into account, and that was the thing that people liked about the manual games, because we did that article, in S&T, where we pointed out a lot of those things. And
Right.
basically, in doing the game, we had to do our research, and that's where I got the phrase. The game will talk back to you after a while. Well, once you get it working, it will tell me, I need this. I need
Right.
that.
Eh.
There's something missing.
And one of the things you figured out in that game was, hey, these Russian troops, nobody really knew what their capabilities were and what their
The
strengths
Russians
were, and you hid that, right?
Yeah. And, the funny thing is, I came up with that idea, and I says, that sounds familiar. Didn't somebody else do it? And somebody said, yeah, you did it in the Franco-Prussian War Games. Ah, well, still.
Okay.
But anyway, so you can reinvent your own wheel. But anyway, yeah, we had all the Russian counters in the beginning were two-sided. And on one side, it just said infantry, tank, whatever. But on the other side, we had an accurate distribution of the German units that were low quality and high quality.
You mean the Russian units, right?
Russian units,
Yeah.
Russian units. And the point was, even the Russians didn't know which units they were best, because Stalin had killed all the known competent officers, and they were basically promoting, battalion and what have you, commanders to command divisions. And it really, in that phase of the war, it took a really magnetic, energetic commander to get the unit together. It wasn't just a matter of making the right decisions on the battlefield, but it was motivating the troops, carrying out training, seeing to the supplies, beg, borrowing, and stealing, enough food, enough fuel, enough ammunition, so his guys could fight. A lot of generals wouldn't do that. They say, hey, I issued an order to the, to the supply secretariat, and they didn't deliver. Well, a good commander will say, well, screw that. I mean, Patton was infamous for that, for that. He was a thief, and all good commanders are thieves. And he'd roll into an area, and it wasn't just the civilians had to worry about Patton's, procurement NCOs, but it was, other American and Allied units. The Marines were like that. The Army said, these Marines, they're thieves. Well, that's why they're so successful. They don't run out of ammo. You might, but they don't. So that had to be represented in the game, but in a way that neither side knew which units were good.
And that was the brilliance of it.
Exactly. I mean, it basically solved a key problem in the campaign. And that's one reason why the game had legs. It had replayability, because no matter how good you came at certain tactics, if you had a bad run of luck, and the Russians had somehow deployed, their 7 best, divisions, without even knowing it, in the path of your main thrust, boom, you were stuck.
All right, I'm going to speak to that. I was playing the Germans one time against a friend of mine in Panzer Group Guderian, launched a main attack and ran right into one of those guards, heavy guards units. It destroys your expectations, I should say.
It destroys your momentum as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's actually one that's on my list to pick up, because I want to experience that. Because it
But that's something the Army admired. They looked at our games and they said, oh, they caught this, they caught that. Because the professionals say, that the amateurs studied tactics, professionals studied logistics, or the unknown, the intelligence factors. And they were always surprised at how we could incorporate that in a playable game. They had games, some of them were computerized games, that nobody understood what the hell was going on. And that's one thing I hammered into Fred McClintock, who had, I don't know if he was what we consider a grog, not a wargamer, but he was familiar with the manual games. He could play them, he could understand the rules and what have you. I says, Fred, you got to make the game accessible. The players have to be able to have. In fact, in one game I did for Ray Macedoni after he retired, he was doing a game for again, sensor fused munitions. That was the big thing back in the 80s.
It was for Textron when he retired and became vice president of analytics.
He scientist for Textron, and they had these sensor fused munitions, which eventually got done. But one thing they needed was a tactical game, which showed how effective or ineffective they would be. And so I got a guy with a workstation. I forget. I calculated it had the power of a 486. That's the well, anyway, it's ancient, but it was the most powerful in the mid '80s, and they had this in this Macintosh, like with a very expensive but very detailed visual display. And I forget the name of it was a language written for building simulations, and they had this guy doing it. And I said,
Simula? No, it wasn't Simula. Okay.
No, but anyway, I've written it in an article somewhere, so you dig through my bibliography, you'll find it. But anyway, the thing I insisted he put in there, I says, look, normally we use, even then the F1 key was becoming, the key for if you wanted help. I says, make the F1 key the truth key. In other words, whenever you're doing in a game, and of course this became standard, not with a key you hit, but you could basically right click or something like that, and up would pop up some explanation in some games. And it would basically show the user how this calculation was made. And I call it, you could drill down. Now he gave me a funny look. I says, no, really, it's important. Because the game, while it was going to be used by some of Ray Macedonia's, key associates who understood, what was going on here, it was also going to be used by some people who did not, who were not really gamers. I mean, they could play a computer game. But as Austin pointed out, they were basically turned off by the black box program. I says,
let me interject something here, Jim, on that. You and I occasionally, singularly instead of double on it, would go up to Boston. And I recall spending 3 days with Macedonia's team where they had actually put this into a fairly, especially for 1986, super graphics on this. They took all that work.
It's a great little game.
Yeah, no, it was. It ultimately led, Dan, to Textron developing a weapon system called wide area munition, WAM. It was finally fielded as a Hornet, which was shoot this up in the air. It'd be triggered by either acoustic, seismic, or potentially a timer, but it was acoustic and seismic sensor systems. Fire it up in the air, and then it has a heat seeking. It would be come down trying to find the engine of a Russian tank, is what the idea
Right.
was.
Yeah.
And what they wanted in the game was, and Ray knew I could do this, I says, you got to put in basically the psychology of the Russian army, which I was well versed in. And so we had variability because I said, look, technically on paper, these munitions could be compromised by just having advancing infantry units who would get out and find it, because basically they're left there in the field. Infantry could sneak up on them. A vehicle would set them off. But the infantry could get in there and just boom, 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 wreck them with a few AK-47 rounds. But I says, not all Russian units are going to deploy like this. The Russians don't have NCOs. I mean, if you had a sergeant major, first sergeants who get in there, you guys do this, do that. No, it had to be junior officers. Can you imagine running an army without NCOs? That's what the Russians were doing, throughout the Cold War. So these troops would be rolling up, boom, a couple of their vehicles to get hit by these wide area munitions. They'd recognize it. They might not. If not, they'd panic. But, we had to assume the word to get back that if you encounter this is what you do. And it would be up to these lieutenants to basically stop the men from panicking, to get them to deploy, look for it and what have you. The Russians didn't train their men like that, and Ray had appreciated that. Anybody who knew anything about the Red Army at that time realized this. It was their great weakness. And
there was also something that it did. It forced the Russians to move down to 2.5 miles an hour walking instead of run that 15, 20 mile an hour heavy armor attack in mass. And Jim, when we put together those geomorphic maps on this, modeled some of it after the Meiningen Gap area, and part of it up in the northern part of the Fulda Gap. I was in the 11th Camp for about a year in the Meiningen Gap. So it was terrain accurate for one of the major fast avenues of approach, and it substantially slowed them down. You know what? That's a big gain for the good guys.
Yeah, I can remember reading about this system and what a game changer it could be for the U.S.
Well, not only that, we tested one of the scenarios and one thing we could do with this game was you could Monte Carlo it. In other words, you could run it over the weekend or overnight, what have you, and basically play itself. But one of the things we had, what happens if the Russians decide just to pull through? Because they've been known to do that. And one of the problems somebody pointed out, I don't know if it was me or one of their Soviet experts, he says, these are elite units. following them are non-elite units, and they really had, and so some general might decide to sacrifice a couple of his regiments, to bull his way through. But the white area munitions took that into account because you could rapidly deploy more of them, and so we concluded from those tests that if the Russians did that, they would take what we call unacceptable losses. But Austin is basically right. No matter what they did, they were going to be slowed down.
Look, and the other thing is it's not fighting the war. These little robots, and that's the way Ray talked about it. I know from a conversation he and I had in 1982 about alternative defenses in West Germany, is that it's not out there fighting by itself. We've got Air Force, our own mechanized forces, and you've in some of these places when they're moving through would be those German, what they call them, Heimatschutz, Einheits, home defense platoons, older reservists out there, the Forestmeister and the like, and these guys are in there monitoring it as well. So what it did was slow a Soviet really attack from garrison down immensely. And that was one of our big fears. It was a fantastic game to try to deal with.
What the white area munitions did, never underestimate the importance of psychology. The Russians were always afraid of American technology. They still are, although now they're afraid of Chinese technology. But anyway, they saw that. They probably even heard about the tactical model I did for Textron. And their analysts, one of whom, I guess this was in the 80s, he was asked to do basically a run through. They had their war game, which were fairly good, their manual game, correlation of forces and what have you. And he concluded that the Red Army could no longer expect to make a run for the Rhine because the American technology, plus we changed our tactics, we'd become offensive. In other words, we weren't just going to defend. We were also training to, was that an air-land battle? We were basically training to hit them in the flank, what have you. And that just scared the bejesus out of the Germans because that's what the Germans would always do to them during World War II. And indeed, we were taking advice from Wehrmacht generals. In fact, there was that conference in 1980 that I got hauled in on where they had these two Wehrmacht generals and a whole bunch of American Army generals in the audience. And they basically explained how they would take advantage of the Russian inflexibility. The classic example he gave was a Russian tank brigade was rolling down past a German tank company that was in flood. In other words, it was hidden. And they saw this German brigade, 30 or 40, tanks rolling by. And they decided, well, let's just get behind them. And they destroyed almost all of them from the rear. And because their absence of radios and who was looking towards the rear, in the Red Army, you look forward. By the time the guy at the front turned around, he had no more people following him, just burning wrecks.
One of those German generals was von Balk, as I recall.
Right, and the other was
I read the transcripts of that in entire at least two of the panels I think they had on it. That fellow was regarded by the Germans as one of their best defensive generals. The U.S. Army in 1975 was training for what was called stay behind too. Especially if we've got beaten back in the covering force, our job was to try to, guess what, go into East Germany and turn around and shoot up some of these secondary forces if we're still on the map, so to speak.
Right.
One of the problems the Russians had in the Second World War, it's not just that Stalin shot all the able officers. He was shooting able people all over the country. So unlike the U.S., where you could get a high school principal and turn him into a infantry lieutenant colonel, they didn't have those people. Because our factory managers and stuff like that were being shot just along with everybody else, and the level of education of the average Russian wasn't that great. Even even though they supposedly were opening schools all over the country, a guy with a high school diploma would frequently end up as a lieutenant, which gives you some idea of how much initiative is this guy going to have on a battlefield.
Yeah, towards the end, they basically developed a wartime army, which was not allowed to exist in peacetime. Yeah. And after the war was over, they reorganized. They sent a lot of these officers with initiative to the Gulag, and it was back to business as usual. And that's one reason why when Stalin died, they basically got rid of Stalinism because the survivors of Stalinism realized this cannot go on. They tried to keep it secret. That was the secret speech Khrushchev made, and that really changed everything. But anyway, that's ancient history. But it will repeat itself.
Right.
So what's happening in Iran, in Iraq, throughout the Middle East.
Yeah.
The Israelis have taken advantage of it, and the Israelis have basically made a great effort not to be bitten by that victory disease bug themselves, or not. Actually, in the case of the Arabs, it wasn't a victory disease. It was just we're Arabs. Allah favors us. We can't lose. It doesn't work.
All right. So one last game I want to cover before we wrap it up, and Avalon Hill had Africa Corps, but they went ahead and picked up what I think S&T called Desert War, and it was subtitled Panzer Army Africa. And they picked that up. Were you involved with it when they picked that one up, or not?
I think so. That was after I left.
Okay, so
I remember when we did that game, it was a much more wide open and quicker game than Africa Corps. It was more accurate as well.
Yeah, everybody was blown up. I've gone back and read some of the comments on it, and because some of the old timers have gone up on Board Game Geek and they've put their own thoughts about the game when it first came out and like that. And they said that they were blown away by the movement factors.
Yes. Yeah. If you had a clear shot, you'd go a long way. But you had to have the logistics. You had to have the fuel. So you had to plan those surges, very carefully. Because that's basically, we realized that was really the key factor in the war in North Africa, the logistics. You could basically stockpile ammo and food and ammunition, what have you, and you'd go roaring off. And assuming you could get the enemy couldn't really put up a good resistance, you could roll all the way to Cairo. Montgomery understood that better than any of the previous British generals. And of course, the Americans, when they came in from the West, we also understood it. In fact, the Germans, some German officers, taken prisoner later in the war, complained, "You Americans don't fight fair. You use all this firepower and you have all this artillery. And why don't you fight like soldiers?" And why? As Patton pointed out in his speeches, he says, "Your job is not to die for your country; it's to make the other guy die for his country.
Yeah.
And if you do that to enough of them, they've lost." So I mean, he was inspiring, whereas the Germans were throwing their hands up and saying, "What the hell can you do?" But although you must keep in mind, this is Trevor Dupee did the research on this when the documents became available. On the tactical level, the Germans would normally win, all things being equal, but all things weren't equal. If we had a big advantage in artillery, in fact, by late 1944, American tank units with Shermans were defeating German tank units with Panthers and late model Mark IVs because we simply had better trained crews, more experienced crews, and they didn't just go out there and get blown up. They would use hard-earned tactics. They knew how the Germans operated, and once they found out they were facing rookies, they just chewed them up. And there were
it's not weapon system on weapon system. It's whole entire system against it.
Yes.
And the Israelis pointed it out. They I think after the 6 Day War, said, "Well, did you have superior weapons?" I don't know. We could have switched weapons with the Arabs, and we still would have beat them. And that some people thought that was bravado, but it was actually quite accurate because the Germans, the Israelis they didn't like to publicize this, but the troops understood it. I remember getting a letter from one Israeli wargamer who was in the army. I think he was in the 67 war. He's in the infantry unit. He says, "We were real Panzer Grenadiers out there." Now, this is something I guess you didn't say in public, and well, maybe you did in Israel, but it was not official policy. They basically created, Jewish Panzer Grenadiers, and even the Germans admired it.
Yeah. So you just mentioned a name that I had meant to speak to you about at some time. That's Lieutenant Colonel Trevor Dupee. Is that how you say his last name?
Dupee.
Dupee. Okay. Did you know him?
Yes, quite well.
Do you want to explain what he contributed? And I think people have lost it. I've started collecting his books again, but he contributed a lot, right?
He was designing war games. So he had two thrusts. One was collecting, source information from both sides, and running analysis, crunching numbers. I mean, basically operations research 101. But he was also trying to develop a war game. And he did. He had a war game system, again, which was similar to the correlation of forces system the Russians used.
Sure.
But the Germans still used, you could recognize there was a gaming board, not hexagons, but you were moving pieces around, and they were using, tables of attrition and movement and what have you. It was quite accurate. In fact, the story, which is true, when we invaded Normandy, the Germans were conducting one of those map exercises, and they said, "Well, should we keep it going?" I says, "Yes, just reorient some of the pieces, as it were." And they used that game as a training tool. And that was the same thing happened with Mark Herman, who was worked for SPI, through the golden years, as it were, and later became a big shot game developer, vice president at Booz Allen. He basically designed the game, and he had just come out before the Gulf War, before Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, called Gulf Strike, whatever it was.
Yeah, Gulf Strike. That was it.
And he basically, some people in the Pentagon knew about it, and within 24 hours, record time for the Pentagon, they put him under contract to use that game, plug in classified information where necessary, and basically predict how the war was going to work out. He did it, and it was very accurate.
Right.
They kept that secret because they had all these millions and millions of dollars worth of computer models, which didn't get up to speed until early '91. But Mark was doing it. Well, he designed the game, but any competent gamer could have done the same thing. And they modified it as needed, played it overnight, and delivered the report the next day. Austin had an example of that when he was down in Southcom, when they needed an instant analysis of a brewing war between
Arabian Nightmare, which you and me
was published
in fall of 1990, and you published it, Jim, in December 1990.
Yeah.
Before, and it had that scenario in there that I wrote up, "Beware the Ides of January."
Yeah,
missed by 2 days.
So one last name I want to talk about with you guys is Steve Patrick. You guys are both great writers, but he was also a great writer for S&T. What's happened to him?
He's still around. I last saw him about 2 years ago at in Pennsylvania, Lancaster, one of the Wargaming conventions.
Yeah.
And he's on Facebook. He's retired now.
Okay. You said he was a lawyer. Is that right?
Lawyer, yeah.
Yeah. He was
general, actually. He was a National Guard general.
Oh, right. He became brigade commander, I believe.
Commander,
Yeah. Had to have me come down and lecture his intelligence officers once in the 80s, I think, when he had his brigade. Yeah, but he was a war game designer, a good historian. He and Al, basically worked together on a lot of those press tags games.
Okay.
Renaissance of Infantry, et cetera, et cetera. Again, that was something Viking. That's why it's so expensive to buy on eBay. Most of those copies got thrown away. But people who know the game, know the system, know it's basically, golden, as it were.
Right.
Gem, a gold gem, old gold, as it were. Because if you wanted to do a computerized, romp through history at the tactical level, that's probably the cheapest place to start.
Yeah.
Way to start.
Yeah. Yeah.
Steal from the best.
Well, we're at the end of our time. I'd just like to tease the next session. We're going to go back and talk about something that you guys did at SPI called the Friday Night Follies. And that will be fun. And then I also want to talk about your I call it a polling system, but reader feedback.
Yeah.
And along with how people played solo games, and then you guys started doing solo games.
Yeah.
And so that's what we'll talk about next time. So we'll be talking, the game specifically we'll be talking about is the Fall of Rome, which you didn't design, but I'm sure you were involved with, and then Operation Olympic and Wolfpack, which, by the way, Phil Sabin, who is the lecturer in England on, I can't think of the war studies is what he lectures on. He calls it the finest solo game ever. So, which is quite a compliment since, you're out there competing against John Butterfield's RAF, which is considered the best by a lot of people. And it may be just because they've never seen Wolfpack and they ought to pull it out. So that's what we'll be talking about next time. And it was great today. All the history stuff along with the game stuff. It was a great session, guys. So we'll talk to you next time.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Did you got the picture, right?
Yeah, I did. And we'll
Good.
get that up. All right.
Yeah. Okay.
Bye.
Have a good
Bye.
weekend.